In the brutal, suffocating heat of a Memphis summer, things rot. They rot quickly. The humidity, thick as a blanket, accelerates the process. A forgotten bag of groceries on the counter, a dead squirrel in the attic, the secrets festering behind the closed doors of a rundown apartment complex. In July of the year 2000, in a tired brick building in the city's blue-collar heartland of Binghamton, a new kind of rot began to seep into the air. It started as a faint, peculiar smell. Not the usual city scents of asphalt and exhaust and barbecue smoke. This was a smell that didn't belong. It was sickly sweet, with a greasy, metallic undertone. It crept from under the door of apartment 3B, the home of Ray Miller and his wife, a quiet woman named Louise. Mrs. Henderson in 3A thought it was a dead mouse in the walls. Mr. Chen in 3C blamed it on someone's garbage left out too long in the oppressive heat. But the smell didn't fade. It grew. It intensified day by day, becoming a physical presence in the hallway, a nauseating miasma that clung to the back of the throat. And with the growing smell came a strange, unnatural silence. Apartment 3B was never silent. Ray Miller was a man whose presence was measured in noise, the angry stomp of his work boots, the television blaring sports at all hours, the drunken, slurred curses that would bleed through the thin walls late at night, followed often by the sound of something breaking and the muffled, terrified sobs of his wife. Ray was a storm of a man, fueled by cheap whiskey and a lifetime of resentments. But for the past few days, the storm had been silent. No TV, no shouting, nothing. The silence was, in its own way, more alarming than the noise. Mrs. Henderson, finally unable to bear the stench and the quiet any longer, called the building manager. The manager, a tired man named Earl, used his master key. It wouldn't turn. The deadbolt was thrown from the inside. That's when he called the police. Officer Davis and his partner were the first on the scene. The smell hit them the moment they stepped onto the third-floor landing. It was a smell unlike anything Davis, a 10-year veteran, had ever encountered. It was the smell of a butcher shop left to fester in the sun, mixed with something chemical and acrid. They announced themselves, knocking loudly on the door. There was no answer. They kicked the door in. The apartment was small and dark. The air inside was thick, almost unbreathable. And there, sitting in a worn-out armchair in the dim light of the living room, was Louise Miller. She was just sitting there, staring at a blank television screen, her face a pale, vacant mask. She didn't flinch when the door crashed open. She didn't seem to notice the two uniformed officers standing in her living room. Davis's partner went to check on her while Davis followed the smell. It led him to the kitchen. It was a small, grimy space, but the source of the odor was immediately obvious. On the stove sat a large, old-fashioned aluminum pressure cooker, the kind people used for canning. It was huge, big enough to hold a Thanksgiving turkey, and it was still slightly warm to the touch. A cold dread, heavy and sickening, settled in Davis's stomach. He called for backup and for the homicide detectives. He knew with a certainty that chilled him despite the suffocating heat what he was about to find. Detective Marcus Thorne arrived 20 minutes later. He was a man who wore the city's grit like a second skin. He had seen the worst of Memphis, from back-alley shootings to domestic disputes that ended in tragedy, but he was not prepared for what he found in apartment 3B. The forensic team, wearing full respirators, carefully opened the pressure cooker. A cloud of putrid steam billowed out, carrying with it a new, even more horrific wave of the stench. Inside, submerged in a thick, bubbling, greasy broth, were the half-dissolved remains of a human body. The flesh had been cooked off the bones in many places, turning into a foul, gelatinous sludge. It was a scene from a cannibal's nightmare. It was what was left of Ray Miller. Back in the living room, Louise Miller finally broke her silence. As the detectives began to question her, she looked up, her eyes slowly focusing as if waking from a long dream. And with a calmness that was perhaps more shocking than the scene in the kitchen, she confessed. "I killed him," she said, her voice a flat, empty whisper. "I killed my husband." The story she told was a litany of suffering, a 17-year descent into hell. She spoke of the man Ray Miller used to be, the man she had married. A handsome, hard-working man with a quick smile. But the years had been unkind. A layoff at the factory, a failed business venture, the slow, insidious creep of alcoholism. The man she loved had been eroded, replaced by a bitter, violent stranger who used his fist to communicate his frustrations. She spoke of the beatings, the random, explosive rages, the verbal abuse that flayed her spirit raw. She showed the detectives the old faded scars on her arms and back, a pale, silent map of her torment. The neighbors, when questioned, confirmed it. They had heard the fights for years. They had seen her with black eyes and split lips. They had pitied her, but no one had ever interfered. In this part of town, people learned to mind their own business. According to Louise, the final night was no different from 100 others. Ray had come home drunk, enraged over a losing bet on a baseball game. He had hit her, thrown a plate against the wall, and then, his fury spent, had collapsed onto the bed and fallen into a deep, alcohol-fueled sleep. "I just snapped," she whispered, her gaze distant. "I couldn't take it anymore. I looked at him lying there snoring, and all the hate, all the fear from all those years, it just boiled up inside me." She said she went to the kitchen. She picked up the heavy wooden mallet they used to crack crabs, a gift from a family trip to the coast years ago. She went back to the bedroom, and she brought it down on Ray's head again and again until he was silent for good. Her description of what followed was disjointed, spoken in a monotone of shock and horror, the panic, the fear of being caught, the desperate, insane idea to get rid of the body, to make him disappear. She claimed she had acted alone, dragging his body to the bathroom, dismembering it with a kitchen knife, and then, piece by piece, cooking it in the big pressure cooker. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to erase her crime. Initially, the story held a grim, tragic logic. A battered wife pushed beyond the limits of human endurance finally strikes back. The public, hearing the whispers from the neighbors, the stories of Ray's abuse, felt a wave of sympathy for Louise. His horrific end was seen by many as a form of karmic justice. A monster had been slain by his victim. Even their 16-year-old daughter, a terrified, quiet girl named Clara, corroborated the story of her father's endless abuse. She had been staying with her aunt on the night of the murder, but she told the police that living with her father was like living with a ticking bomb. But Detective Marcus Thorne was a man who didn't believe in simple stories. And the more he looked at the scene, the more he listened to Louise's confession, the more the inconsistencies began to pile up. The first red flag was the apartment itself. The kitchen was a house of horrors, but the rest of the apartment, particularly the bedroom where Louise claimed the murder had taken place, was too clean. Meticulously, unnaturally clean. There were no signs of a violent struggle, no blood spatter on the walls or the cheap pressboard headboard. The carpet showed no stains. A man's head being bludgeoned with a mallet is not a tidy event. It's a spray of blood and tissue. But here, there was nothing. Then there was the detail from the medicine cabinet. Tucked behind a bottle of aspirin, a forensic tech found a vial of prescription sleeping pills. They were common, easily obtained, but the vial, which should have been nearly full according to the prescription date, was missing a significant number of pills. When asked about them, Louise seemed genuinely confused. She claimed she never used them. She had omitted them entirely from her confession. A toxicology report on the remains from the pressure cooker later confirmed it. In addition to a high level of alcohol, Ray Miller's system contained a massive dose of sedatives. He hadn't just been drunk, he had been drugged, he had been completely helpless. And then there was the dismemberment. Thorne had seen his share of gruesome crime scenes. He knew what a panicked, frenzied attack looked like. This wasn't it. The forensic pathologist, a seasoned professional named Dr. Evans, confirmed his suspicions. "The cuts on the bones are clean," Evans told him, his voice grim. "They're precise. This wasn't a frenzied hack job with a kitchen knife." The major joints were separated cleanly. This was done by someone who was calm, methodical, someone with a steady hand, maybe even someone with some anatomical knowledge, or at least someone with a lot of strength and the right tools. This contradicted Louise's narrative of a small, terrified woman acting in a blind panic. Louise's own demeanor was another inconsistency. After her initial confession, her calmness was unsettling. She was coherent, her story detailed and consistent, almost as if it had been rehearsed. For a woman who claimed to have been in a state of pure panic, she seemed remarkably composed. Thorne had interrogated enough killers to recognize the difference between the blankness of shock and the cold placidity of a liar. He started digging deeper into the Millers' lives. He discovered that Ray, while undeniably an abusive alcoholic in his later years, hadn't always been a monster. Old work colleagues from the factory remembered him as a diligent worker, a good friend when he was sober. Friends from their younger days spoke of a man who had once adored his wife. The slide had been gradual, fueled by failure and financial pressure. He was a man broken by life, who in turn broke the person closest to him. The biggest crack in Louise's story came from a small, forgotten savings passbook they found tucked away in a box of Ray's old things. It showed a balance of just over $10,000. Not a fortune, but a significant amount for a family living paycheck to paycheck, a secret nest egg. When asked about it, Louise claimed to have no knowledge of it, but Thorne wondered, was it possible there was a financial motive she was hiding? The real breakthrough, however, came from the most vulnerable source. The daughter, Clara. In sessions with a child psychologist, the terrified teenager began to open up. Her memories were fragmented, shrouded in fear, but they were crucial. She spoke of her mother's increasing secrecy in the months before the murder. She remembered her mother making quiet, furtive phone calls when she thought no one was listening. She remembered her mother starting to go out more often, for walks or to meet a friend, always with a vague explanation. A neighbor, the same Mrs. Henderson who had first called the police, unknowingly corroborated Clara's story. She told Thorne she'd seen Louise a few times down at the local market talking to a man, an unfamiliar man. She said they looked very close, intimate. Working from Clara's fragmented memories of phone calls, and with a warrant for the home's phone records, they found a number that had been called repeatedly in the weeks leading up to the murder. It was a number that didn't belong to any known friend or relative. It was registered to a man named Frank Gallo, a 38-year-old construction worker. When the detectives first approached Frank Gallo at his job site, he was a wall of denial. He claimed he didn't know any Louise Miller. But when they presented him with the phone records with the neighbor's eyewitness account of their meetings, his story crumbled. He and Louise eventually admitted to having a relationship, an affair. Louise tried to downplay it, calling it a simple friendship, a shoulder to cry on. But Frank, a lonely man with a hangdog expression, confessed that Louise had been his only source of hope, his reason for getting up in the morning. Frank Gallo immediately became a key suspect. He denied any knowledge of the murder, offering a weak alibi that he was at home alone, watching TV on the night in question. But an eyewitness, a late-night delivery driver, had seen a man matching Frank's description and his distinctive old Ford pickup parked down the street from the Miller's apartment building late on the night Ray was killed. Frank's background as a construction worker meant he had the physical strength and the familiarity with tools that could explain the professional dismemberment. He was exactly the kind of accomplice a smaller woman like Louise would need to carry out such a gruesome task. The final, damning piece of physical evidence came from a meticulous re-examination of the bedroom. Under the bed, tucked deep against the wall, a crime scene technician found a small, cheap-looking button. It didn't match any of Louise's or Ray's clothing. It did, however, perfectly match the buttons on the worn work shirt Frank Gallo had been wearing the day they first questioned him, and on the handle of the small hand, sword that Louise had eventually admitted to using for the dismemberment, a saw she claimed to have bought herself. Forensics found a faint, partial fingerprint. Despite her efforts to clean it, the print remained. It belonged to Frank Gallo. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, Frank Gallo broke down. He confessed to being at the apartment, but he swore he had arrived after Ray was already dead. He said Louise had called him in a state of utter panic, saying she had done something terrible. He claimed he had rushed over, and out of a blind, desperate love for her, he had agreed to help her. He was the one, he admitted, who had dismembered the body. He was the one who had helped her cook the remains. He did it, he said, because he was terrified of what would happen to her if she were caught. He insisted over and over that he had not participated in the actual killing. But the story still didn't sit right with Thorne. The meticulous planning, the sedatives, the cleanliness of the crime scene, it all pointed to premeditation. It pointed to Louise. He found proof of this when he canvassed local hardware stores. He found a clerk who remembered Louise coming in a few days before the murder. She had bought large plastic garbage bags, duct tape, and the small handsaw, all the tools needed for a clean, efficient disposal. She wasn't a panicked victim. She was a woman on a mission. Under renewed, intense questioning, Louise's story began to shift dramatically. The mask of the long-suffering victim fell away, replaced by the cunning of a cornered animal. She tried to pin it all on Frank. She claimed he was the instigator, that he had manipulated her, playing on her misery, convincing her that killing Ray was the only way out. She painted him as a violent, controlling man who had threatened her into going along with his plan. This desperate attempt to recast herself as a victim only served to expose her true, manipulative nature. The final, heartbreaking nail in her coffin was the detailed testimony of her own daughter. Clara, now feeling safe and supported, remembered everything. She remembered her mother giving her father a special drink that night, a hangover cure to help him sleep, a drink that Clara now knew contained the sleeping pills. She remembered her mother locking her in her bedroom for the night, something she never did. She remembered being woken up by a strange thudding noise from her parents' room, a noise she had been too terrified to investigate. Most damningly, she recounted overhearing her mother on the phone with Uncle Frank weeks before, talking about getting rid of him so they could have a better future. She had even heard them mention the money her father had been saving. The murder of Ray Miller was not an act of spontaneous self-defense. It was a cold, calculated execution planned and orchestrated by his wife, Louise. Frank Gallo, in turn, confronted with Clara's testimony, told the whole truth. He revealed how Louise had masterfully manipulated him, preying on his loneliness, promising him a life together, a life funded by the very savings she claimed not to know about. He admitted to providing the sleeping pills. He admitted to being there that night. He had helped Louise hold Ray down while she, in a cold, methodical rage, had brought the mallet down on her husband's head. The reconstruction of the crime was chilling in its efficiency. Louise had acquired the tools. She had drugged her husband into a state of utter helplessness. She had lured her lover into her plan with promises of love and money. Together, they had committed the murder. Together, they had dismembered the body. And together, they had attempted to erase their crime in the most grotesque way imaginable, boiling the evidence down into a foul, unidentifiable soup. Louise's true motives were a dark, complex tapestry of hatred and greed. 17 years of abuse had planted a seed of pure black hatred in her heart. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about the $10,000. It was about starting a new life with a new man. It was about an extreme selfish desire to get what she wanted, no matter the cost. Her cruelty, her malevolence, was laid bare in the horrifying act of cooking her husband's remains, a final, absolute act of desecration. In a final, dramatic confrontation in the interrogation room with both of them present, the web of lies completely unraveled. Frank, broken by guilt and his own foolishness, gave a detailed account of Louise's manipulation. Louise, seeing that the game was over, finally admitted to everything. She confessed to being the mastermind. She confessed to striking the fatal blows. She confessed that her motives were a bitter cocktail of revenge, greed, and a deep-seated desire for absolute control over her own life, a control she had taken in the most brutal way possible. The aftermath of the case sent shockwaves through the community. The initial sympathy for Louise curdled into disgust and outrage. The story of the pressure cooker murder, as it became known, was a grim, cautionary tale. It highlighted the silent epidemic of domestic violence, the failures of a system that provides no easy escape for its victims. But it also revealed the terrifying truth that the line between victim and perpetrator can sometimes blur and then be erased completely. The most tragic figure in the entire saga was Clara. Orphaned, Traumatized, burdened with the knowledge of her parents' monstrous acts, she was left to navigate an uncertain future, forever haunted by the memory of the smell in the hallway and the silence from apartment 3B. At the trial, the verdict was swift. Based on the overwhelming evidence and their own confessions, Louise Miller was sentenced to death for the calculated and exceptionally brutal murder of her husband. Her lover and accomplice, Frank Gallo, for his active role in the planning, the murder itself, and the horrific dismemberment, received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Detective Marcus Thorne attended the sentencing. He watched as they led Louise away, her face once again a placid, unreadable mask. He thought about the complex, ugly nature of human relationships. He thought about how love can curdle into hate, how desperation can mutate into monstrousness. The case was closed, but the memory of the heat, the silence, and the unimaginable horror simmering in that pressure cooker would stay with him forever. It was another layer of rot, another dark secret that the city of Memphis would absorb into its already haunted soul.